Let's talk for a second about what actually happened in the time leading up to everyone going to 34 Fairview. Brian Albert, Brian Higgins show up drunk at the Waterfall. They'd been drinking in the afternoon. You know about the flirtatious texts that were sent between Karen Reed and Brian. Higgins was clearly pining over Karen, but for her, the flirtation had ran its course. It was done. She was happy and committed to John. You could see that in her actions with John that night. You don't have to guess.
Brian Higgins sees Karen Reed enter the bar.
I didn't know she or John O'Keefe would even be there.
His attention is quickly turned to John O'Keefe approaching. John greets him with a warm embrace, then does the same with Brian Albert. Brian Albert and John show affection by patting each other's backs. Brian Higgins leans in, asking John where they're coming from. John points, indicating they were across the street at C.F. McCarthy's. John sees Karina Kolokithis, prompting him to walk over and say hello with a hug. He also says hello to Nick Kolokithis, and then John walks further towards the bar to greet Matt McCabe. Brian Albert whispers something into Higgins' ear. Higgins smiles back, amused, then glances at John, indicating he is the subject of their conversation. Higgins comments back to Brian Albert, and Brian Albert responds with another whisper. Higgins smiles again at whatever Brian Albert said, and then Nicole Albert returns from the restroom, approaches husband Brian and embraces him from behind, prompting the three to converse quietly to each other. Nicole and Brian Albert speak closely for a time, as Higgins watches. Higgins stands to step away to a more isolated location and signals Brian Albert to follow. He wants to say something that even Nicole shouldn't hear. This may be where the idea to confront John is born. We jump ahead 3 minutes later, and Higgins, Brian Albert and wife Nicole are still positioned on one side of the table away from the rest of the group, almost as if they were spectators sitting in the front row watching a play. Brian Higgins takes a photo. His flash goes off in 3, 2, 1. He appears to have pointed the camera through the gap between Brian and Nicole Albert's backs, across the table, and taken a photo in the direction Karen Reed was standing. We know this because we then see her return, walking from that area back to John's side. John puts his arm around her and she speaks to Karina and Nick Kolokithis. We continue to see a series of flashes happening on the far side of the table, indicating photos are being taken by the group. Higgins appears to be posing for one between Brian and Nicole. None entered into evidence. Caitlin Albert sits here. Chris Albert stands here, at the left end of the high top. The clock strikes 11 p.m. and 32 minutes later, Higgins, feeling completely ignored, sends a text message to Karen.
When you texted her, well, at Waterfall, she ignored that text too, correct?
Well, that was the only text I sent that night to her, yes.
Okay.
She didn't respond.
That wasn't my question.
What
My question is, she ignored the text, correct?
Well, I don't know if I don't know what her mindset was. If she purposely ignored the text, or she didn't see it, I don't know. I didn't read into it.
Did she ignore the text, Mr. Higgins?
I don't know.
Did she respond to the text?
She did not respond.
Got it.
We jump ahead 15 minutes. Higgins checks his phone, growing frustrated that Karen has not responded to his desperate message. John glances at his phone as well to check the time. It's getting late and almost closing. Karen and Jen McCabe converse, appearing friendly and in good spirits. They laugh together. Karen initiates a group hug, putting her right arm around Matt McCabe and her left arm around Jen McCabe. John, however, seems to take a step back. The Bryans are heavily intoxicated and feeling aggressive. They have identified their adversary in John O'Keefe and are acting out their primal rage with a male display of dominance, otherwise known as peacocking. Jen McCabe picks up on it, but unfortunately for Higgins, Karen has her back turned. He has absolutely no idea how to get the attention from her he so desperately desires. In fact, when he realizes that he's not in her field of view, he seems to end the display. For now.
She actually positioned herself away from you at the other end of the table on the opposite side in the corner. Isn't that right?
Jen and Matt McCabe hold Karen in prolonged embrace. However, what's strange is they never once mention to her that there's an after-party at Brian's house. For Karen, at least, there's a surprise in store. Meanwhile, John has taken notice of the Bryans. Higgins, humiliated, needs validation from Brian that he's powerful. He has worth. Higgins and Brian continue their private conversation, able to speak more freely since no one is close. If not planning, they were likely exchanging toxic ideas, building animosity towards John, who doesn't seem to be fully in on the joke quite yet. Higgins is feeling insecure and less than. Jen McCabe continues to speak to John and Karen, with Matt standing out of view to the far right. Karen would be forgiven for believing these people are her friends. At first, I considered this may be when Jen McCabe invited John and Karen to 34 Fairview for the after-party, but then I recalled this.
I said, can we make sure we're welcome here? Nobody extended the invite to me. I didn't hear the invite extended to you.
So when, exactly, was John invited? And for what purpose was he to be there? Here comes Chris Albert entering the vicinity of Brian and Higgins. Karen chats with Brian and Chris Albert, but her eyes never find Higgins. Imagine the storm of emotions he must be weathering, standing just inches away from the woman who has consumed his thoughts for weeks. She's right there, so close, yet he is helplessly bound by his own fear, unable to utter a single word. There's nothing more excruciating than being invisible to the one you desire most. Karina has her jacket on. She says goodbye and hugs John for the last time. She then tells her husband Nick that she just needs to say goodbye to Karen before they leave. Higgins is frozen like a deer, hoping not to be noticed, his body oriented towards Brian Albert's back, staring blankly into the side of his head. An inferno of anger, frustration, and embarrassment swirls inside of him, growing exponentially with every passing second. She didn't reply to the text message I sent over an hour ago. She hasn't said hello to me. She hasn't even acknowledged my existence. How could she do this to me? I told her I wanted the real deal. Isn't that what women want?
I don't know where she was all night, no. I don't know.
Did that upset you, that she ignored you or didn't pay attention to you?
I did not feel ignored and didn't upset me at all.
But it bothered you enough to send her a text, didn't it? What the hell, Karen? What about me?
Karen and Karina are saying goodnight. The Bryans continue their performance of alpha dominance, less a calculated strategy and more a mirror of their restless and intoxicated psychological states. Brian likes to fight when he's drinking, and Higgins has been outmatched. Humiliated by a taller, better-looking, much more charming man who doesn't even seem completely aware yet of the dynamics in play. A haunting moment occurs when John and Higgins lock eyes, In 3, 2, 1. John must sense now that something is off. Is it just that Higgins has had one drink too many? Or is John beginning to piece it together, understanding what this is really about?
And then there's that sparring and fighting that he and Brian Albert were engaged in. Of all the things they could be doing, this is what they were doing just minutes before John O'Keefe walked into that house at 34 Fairview.
The bar is closing in 5 minutes. It's last call and John offers to buy them a final drink. They decline. Notice here how kind and reserved John appears, smiling and being respectful, while the Bryans are sloppy and have clearly lost control of their faculties. John watches as Brian and Higgins can't seem to keep their hands off each other. Remember, this was their state as they waited for John to walk into 34 Fairview just moments later. They felt invincible, but in reality were barely able to stand. It's easy to see how John might have overpowered them, perhaps pushing them to take drastic measures, or causing a third person to jump in and help. After all, no one can be allowed to beat up an Albert in his own home. That simply cannot happen, especially by a lower-ranking fellow Boston cop like John. Chris Albert hugs Caitlin since he's not going to the after-party with everyone else, and the rest of the Alberts head towards the door, including Higgins. Chris Albert forcibly grabs Higgins by the arm, telling him to stop with the taunting. Higgins looks at Brian for the okay. Chris and Higgins look to Brian. It's fine. Brian allows Higgins to continue. Chris raises his arms and gestures that it's too out in the open, with people watching. But whatever Brian says goes, and Higgins continues. Now, Higgins makes 3 attempts to get John's attention. The first 2 times, John wasn't looking. The third time, Higgins waves his arms and yells. John gets the message and appears to acknowledge it. I believe Higgins was yelling, "We need to have a talk. Go to Fairview."
And you didn't say goodbye to John, right?
I don't think I said goodbye to anybody.
And you didn't talk to him about coming over to 34 Fairview.
No.
Brian Higgins, however, you can see in his actions, he wasn't quite so satisfied and he wasn't done.
How would you describe sort of the general sort of tone or demeanor within the group at the Waterfall that night?
It was fine. Everyone was just having a good time.
So no arguments, anything like that?
No, not at all.
Chris Albert knows exactly what was said between Brian Albert, Higgins, and John. And interestingly enough, he decided to walk home instead of attending the after-party with everyone else. Karen is still chatting with Karina and doesn't notice any of what had just transpired. We jump ahead to 12:10, and it's time for everyone to leave the establishment. From what we can see, John has been standing alone, conversing with no one, since the outbursts from Higgins 12 minutes ago. What was on his mind? What was he thinking about?
That's when Jennifer McCabe went up to Karen and said, "You're coming with me." And she grabbed her, she put her arm around her and she said in front of me, "Hey, you come with me. We're gonna, and Karen said, "Where are we going?" And Jen said, it doesn't matter. It'll be a surprise."
Was it a surprise or a secret? Jen McCabe, Karina, and Karen Reed exit first. Chris knows Higgins and Brian stormed out, so what is he still doing here? Is he discussing it with John, coaxing him to go there and talk to them? Chris Albert heads to the men's room, using it before the walk home. John stands alone, with just Matt and Nick left chatting in the corner. He decides it's time to go and walks out of the Waterfall bar for the last time. Whatever John thought was up with the Bryans, he kept to himself.
You texted John O'Keefe, "You coming here?"
I did.
And that had 3 question marks behind it, correct?
Yes.
A few minutes after receiving that text, John was severely beaten and would be dead in a matter of hours. There's certainly motive for Higgins to want to harm John. But what about Brian Albert? Why would he harbor negative feelings towards him? John and Brian Albert were both Boston police officers at the time, and Albert allegedly has a history of violence against other officers, perhaps because he was high-ranking and knew he had power over them. There were never consequences, not for Brian. If he had an issue with John, he may have wanted to address it, cop to cop, and put John back in line. But what issue could he have had with John? Asking that question, I remembered something that was said during the trial. John wanted to know if one specific person would be at the waterfall before he agreed to come. And now, I'm asking myself why. I leave you with this.
What, if any, communication do you recall in regard to who was there or who was going to be there?
With Mr. O'Keefe?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think at some point he said, who's there? And I said, my brother Brian. I said, Brian. He said, your brother Brian? I said, yeah, Brian and Brian Higgins are there. And he said, where's your brother Kevin? And I said, I have no clue.
Was there tension in John's relationship with Kevin that could have upset the Alberts, requiring an intervention from Brian?